My name is Martha Vance. At 74, I've spent more time in probate courts than most people spend in their own living rooms. I've seen families tear each other apart over a silver spoon, so I know that blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes it's just a lubricant for greed. This story involves my younger sister Alice and her two children, Clara, who stayed behind to care for her, and Julian, the golden child. Julian was the kind of son every mother dreams of, or so it seemed. He moved to the city, wore $3,000 loafers, and sent postcards from yachts. Alice worshipped the ground he walked on. Clara, meanwhile, was the one who did the heavy lifting. She lived in a small apartment nearby, worked 2 jobs, and spent every weekend cleaning Alice's house, managing her medications, and taking her to doctor's appointments. Everything changed when Alice had a minor stroke. She was still sharp, but she was physically frail. That's when Julian suddenly remembered he had a mother. He moved back into Alice's beautiful $1.5 million historic estate, claiming he wanted to supervise her recovery. I watched from across the street, my lawyer's instincts prickling. Julian wasn't there to help. He was there because his high-flying lifestyle in the city had collapsed into a mountain of debt. I saw the way he started whispering in Alice's ear. He told her that Clara was exhausted and resentful of the care work. He suggested that Clara was only staying around to see what she could get in the will. It was a classic isolation tactic. Within a month, Julian had convinced Alice to give him medical power of attorney, claiming it would take the burden off poor Clara. Clara was heartbroken, but she didn't want to cause a scene that might stress her mother's heart. I told her to stay calm. I told her that in the world of probate law, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. I started keeping a log of every time Julian entered that house and every time he turned Clara away at the door. The trap was being set, but not by me, not yet. Julian was setting a trap for himself. He just didn't know I was the one holding the keys to the cage. Isolation is the first step in any inheritance theft. Julian began upgrading the house security, changing the codes so Clara couldn't get in without him there. He told the neighbors that Alice was resting and confused, painting a picture of a woman who had lost her mental capacity. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was preparing the ground to challenge any previous wills. One Tuesday night, I saw a strange car in the driveway, a mobile notary. I didn't knock on the door. I sat in my darkened kitchen with a pair of binoculars and a notebook. Julian was moving fast. The next morning, Clara called me in tears. Julian had told her that Alice had voluntarily revised her will. The new document disinherited Clara entirely, leaving the house, the $500,000 investment portfolio, and all family heirlooms to Julian. But that wasn't the worst part. Julian also had her sign a quit-claim deed, transferring the house into his name immediately. He told Alice it was a tax-saving strategy. In reality, he now owned the roof over her head. The very next day, a senior placement consultant arrived at the house. Julian was scouting for the cheapest state-run nursing homes in the county. He planned to dump his mother in a facility and sell the house by the end of the month. I spent that night in my home office, pulling the property records. There it was. The deed was filed electronically at 9 a.m. Julian thought he was a genius. He thought because Alice had signed the papers, the law was on his side. He didn't realize that as a probate attorney, I knew a secret about the golden child psychology. They always underestimate the quiet sibling and the old aunt. I contacted an old colleague of mine, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in undue influence. I also reached out to the notary who had visited the house. Julian had made one fatal error in his haste. He had used a notary who owed me a very large professional favor from a case 10 years ago. I began drafting a document of my own, something I called an irrevocable life care trust agreement. It was the legal equivalent of a landmine, and Julian was about to step on it with both of his $3,000 loafers. Julian was desperate for cash. His creditors in the city were circling, and he needed to sell Alice's house fast. However, he ran into a problem. The capital gains tax on a $1.5 million property sale would be massive, since the house wasn't his primary residence. This was his pressure point. I decided it was time for Aunt Martha to pay a visit. I walked over to the house with a plate of cookies and a stack of legal advice. I sat in the living room with Julian, acting like the supportive, impressed aunt. "Julian, dear, I heard you're handling Alice's estate now. That's so responsible of you. But I'm worried about the IRS taking 40% of that house's value when you sell it." Julian's ears perked up. He was arrogant enough to believe that I, an old woman, was just trying to be helpful to the new man of the house. I showed him a document I had prepared, the Family Estate Tax Shield. I explained that by signing this, he would be designating the house as a multi-generational asset. I told him it would legally wipe out his tax liability on the sale. To Julian, it looked like a gift from heaven. It was filled with dense, archaic legal jargon about remainderment interests and life estate consents. What Julian didn't realize was that hidden in the middle of page 12 was a personal guarantee of maintenance. By signing that document, he wasn't just protecting the house from taxes, he was legally agreeing to be personally and financially responsible for his mother's care for the rest of her life, at a standard equal to her current lifestyle. Most importantly, it included a lien trigger. If he ever tried to sell the house or move Alice to a lower standard facility, the document automatically granted Clara a 100% ownership stake in the property as a penalty for breach of fiduciary duty. Julian didn't even call a lawyer. He was so blinded by the prospect of saving $300,000 in taxes that he signed the tax shield right there at the kitchen table. He even thanked me. He thought he had just cheated the government and his sister in one move. He had no idea that he had just signed a contract that turned him into Alice's permanent financial servant. I took the document, had it notarized with my friend in the car outside, and headed straight to the county recorder's office. The golden child had just handed me the rope to hang his own future. 3 days after signing my tax shield, Julian made his move. He told Clara that Alice needed professional help and that he had found a lovely facility for her. When Clara went to check the place, she found a horrifying, understaffed warehouse for the elderly on the edge of town. It was a Medicaid-only facility, the kind of place where people go to be forgotten. Julian had already packed Alice's bags and listed the house on a quick sale real estate site for $1.2 million, hoping for a fast cash exit. He thought he was being efficient. He had the deed, he had the power of attorney, and he had the tax shield, or so he thought. He called a family meeting at Alice's bedside to break the news. He put on a performance of deep sadness, telling Alice that this was for her own good. Alice was confused, her eyes searching for Clara, who was standing in the corner, trembling with rage. "I've already signed the intake papers," Julian said, checking his Rolex. "The transport van will be here in an hour. It's a done deal." That's when I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I just pulled a certified copy of the personal guarantee of maintenance from my briefcase. "Actually, Julian," I said, "the deal is far from done. In fact, it's about to get very expensive for you." I handed him the document. "Do you remember the tax shield you signed? Page 12, paragraph 4. You legally guaranteed that Alice would receive care equal to her current standard of living. If you move her to that state-funded facility, you are in immediate breach of contract. And because you signed the personal guarantee, the cost of moving her to a luxury private pay facility, which cost $15,000 a month, will be billed directly to your personal bank accounts in the city." Julian's smirk vanished. "You're bluffing. That document was about taxes." "It was about many things, Julian," I said calmly, "including the fact that if you fail to pay for her luxury care, or if you attempt to sell this house against the multi-generational clause, the ownership of this estate automatically reverts to Clara as the primary caregiver. You didn't just sign a tax shield, you signed a kill switch on your own inheritance." Julian was trapped, but he was still arrogant. He thought he could outrun the kill switch by selling the house before I could get a court date. He called his real estate agent and told him to accept the first cash offer, no matter how low. He figured once he had the money in an offshore account, he could disappear and leave us with a piece of paper that didn't matter. But he forgot that I wasn't just a retired lawyer. I was a former board member of the very bank he used for his city accounts. This was where his greed met my influence. I had already filed an emergency injunction to freeze assets based on the personal guarantee he had signed, because he had admitted in the document that he was using his personal funds to guarantee Alice's care. I was able to prove to a judge that he was attempting to dissipate assets to avoid his legal obligations. While Julian was on the phone with his agent, his phone suddenly started blowing up with alerts. His credit cards were declined. His investment account showed a balance of $0.00. He couldn't even pay for the transport van he had called to take Alice away. He came storming into my house, his face purple with rage. "What did you do? You froze my accounts. That's illegal." "No, Julian," I said, sitting calmly with my tea. "It's called a prejudgment attachment. Since you've already breached the life care agreement by attempting to move Alice to a substandard facility, the court has locked your funds to ensure Alice's $15,000 a month care is covered for the next 5 years. You're not a millionaire anymore, Julian. You're a debtor." He realized then that he couldn't sell the house either. The multi-generational clause I had him sign had placed a cloud on the title. No title insurance company in the world would touch that house until Clara signed off on it. He was sitting on a $1.5 million asset that he couldn't sell, while his personal bank accounts were being drained to pay for a private nurse for the mother he tried to abandon. He was effectively bankrupted by his own signature. He sat on my sofa and put his head in his hands. The golden child was finally starting to see the bars of the cage he had built for himself. But the worst was coming. I wasn't just going to freeze his money, I was going to make sure he never saw a penny of his mother's estate ever again. Julian was desperate. With his accounts frozen and the house unsellable, he tried a final dark move. He attempted to use his medical power of attorney to stop Alice's unnecessary treatments, hoping that if she passed away quickly, the life care agreement would end and he would inherit the house through the new will he had forced her to sign. It was a cold, calculated move that only a true predator would consider. But I had anticipated this end game. In probate law, there's something called the Slayer statute. Usually it applies to people who physically harm someone to get an inheritance. However, in our state, the law had recently been expanded to include culpable elder neglect for financial gain. By attempting to withhold medical care from Alice while he stood to inherit her estate, Julian was walking straight into a criminal trap. I didn't tell him this. I let him try. I had already installed medical monitors, authorized by Clara, who still had secondary medical rights, at Alice's bedside. The moment Julian instructed the doctors to stop all non-essential heart medications, the hospital's legal ethics committee was alerted. They didn't just deny his request, they reported him for elder abuse. I met him at the hospital with 2 detectives. "Julian," I said, "by trying to shorten Alice's life to save your bank account, you've just triggered a fitness audit. The state now views you as a threat to the testator. This doesn't just revoke your power of attorney, it triggers a legal disqualification. Under the Slayer statute, if you are found guilty of neglect for financial gain, you are legally treated as if you died before Alice. You are erased from the will entirely." Julian's eyes went wide. He realized that the midnight signature he had forced Alice to sign was now worthless. If he was disqualified, the law defaulted back to the previous will, the one where Alice left everything to Clara. He had fought so hard to steal the inheritance that he had legally made himself dead in the eyes of the probate court. Julian was taken into a private room for questioning. He wasn't just losing the house anymore. He was looking at a felony charge. I walked back to Alice's room and held her hand. The golden child was gone, and for the first time in months, she was safe. While Julian was busy dealing with the detectives, I turned my attention to the midnight will and the quitclaim deed. I didn't just want them canceled. I wanted them destroyed so thoroughly that they could never be used as a nuisance suit later. I brought in a forensic document examiner. We didn't just look at the signature. We looked at the ink, the pressure of the pen, and most importantly, the digital metadata from the notary's electronic log. We discovered that the notary had been assisted by Julian. The notary's GPS showed he was only at the house for 6 minutes, not nearly enough time to explain a 20-page will to a stroke victim. Furthermore, we found that Julian had used a signature guide to force Alice's hand. This wasn't just undue influence, this was document fraud. I called Julian's city lawyers, the ones he owed money to, and invited them to a settlement conference. I showed them the evidence of the fraud. I showed them the life care agreement he had signed. I showed them the Slayer statute filing. I told them, your client is a sinking ship. If you continue to represent him, you will be filing frivolous motions based on forged documents. That's a quick way to lose your licenses. They dropped him within the hour. Without a lawyer and with no access to his frozen funds, Julian was a man without a country. He tried to call Clara and beg for family mercy. He told her he was sorry and that he was just stressed about his debts. Clara, finally finding her voice, told him, you didn't care about Mom's stress when you tried to put her in that warehouse. You didn't care about my stress when you changed the locks. You only care about the money, and the money is gone. I prepared the final filing for the court, a petition for annulment of fraudulent transfers. I had the notary's confession, the forensic report, and the hospital's neglect report. It was a legal royal flush. Julian had no cards left to play. He was sitting in a cheap motel room, his car about to be repossessed, while the historic estate he tried to steal was being restored to its rightful state. But I wasn't done. I wanted to make sure he felt exactly what he tried to make Alice feel, the terror of having no home and no future. The court date for the annulment was a mere formality. The judge was horrified by the evidence of Julian's midnight will and the Slayer statute neglect. In a single afternoon, the judge voided the deed, canceled the new will, and issued a permanent restraining order for financial protection against Julian. The house was officially Alice's again, with Clara appointed as her legal guardian. But there was one final piece of business. Julian was still technically living in the guest wing of Alice's house, claiming he had tenant rights. He thought he could squat there for months while he figured things out. He forgot that I had drafted the life care agreement with a very specific immediate possession clause in the event of a breach. I arrived at the house with the sheriff and a moving crew. I didn't knock. I had the locksmith open the door. Julian was in the kitchen, eating Alice's food, looking disheveled. "You can't do this," he yelled. "I'm a resident here." "Actually, Julian," I said, handing him the judge's signed order, "you're a trespasser with malicious intent. The life care agreement you signed explicitly states that upon a breach of fiduciary duty, your right to occupy the premises is terminated instantly. Your belongings have already been packed. They're in those boxes on the lawn." I watched as the sheriff escorted the golden child out of the house he tried to steal. He was wearing his $3,000 loafers, but they were scuffed and dirty. He had no car, no bank account, and no home. He looked at the boxes of his designer clothes sitting on the grass and then at the neighbors who were all watching from their porches. The public shaming was complete. "Where am I supposed to go?" he whimpered. "I hear that state-funded facility you like so much has a few openings in their indigent wing. Maybe you can see if they'll take you." The sheriff led him to the edge of the property. For the first time in her life, Alice's home was quiet. Clara walked out onto the porch and looked at me. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't shaking. She was the one in charge now. The golden child had been evicted, not just from the house, but from the family history. With Julian gone, the healing began. Alice returned home from the hospital, and with the personal guarantee funds we had seized from Julian's frozen accounts, we hired the best private nursing team in the state. The historic estate was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. Clara was able to quit her second job, focusing entirely on her mother's recovery and managing the estate. We went through the house and removed every trace of Julian's presence. We changed the locks, the security codes, and even the furniture he had bought with Alice's money. We found the family heirlooms he had hidden in the attic, preparing to sell them on the black market. The silver tea set, the grandmother's jewelry, the antique clock, everything was restored to its rightful place. This was the ultimate irony. The very money Julian had hoarded and hidden in the city was now the endowment that ensured Alice would never have to worry about a bill again. By signing my tax shield agreement, he had effectively created a self-funding trust for the mother he tried to abandon. He had bankrupted himself to provide her with a life of luxury. I sat with Clara and Alice on the back porch. Alice was looking better than she had in years. The stress of Julian's care was the real weight on her heart. "Martha," Alice whispered, her voice stronger now, "I never thought he would do those things. I wanted to believe he was the boy I raised." "He chose the path he took, Alice," I said. "He thought he was playing a game of chess. He just didn't realize he was playing against someone who wrote the rule book." We watched the sunset over the garden. The estate was safe, the inheritance was secure, and the golden child was now a cautionary tale. Clara looked at the silver locket she was wearing. It had been her father's. "He would be proud of you, Aunt Martha," she said. I just smiled. In my world, justice isn't always fast, but when it arrives, it's absolute. The final chapter of Julian Vance was written in a courtroom a year later. He was convicted of grand larceny by fraud and felonious elder abuse. Because he had no money for a high-priced defense, he was assigned a public defender who was overwhelmed and uninterested. Julian was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, but the real last receipt came from the IRS. Remember the tax shield I had him sign? Well, because the court had found the entire transaction to be fraudulent, the IRS determined that Julian owed back taxes and penalties on the attempted transfer of the house. Even in prison, he was being hounded by the government for money he never actually had. He was a man with a mountain of debt that would follow him until the day he died. I still live across the street. Every morning I see Clara out in the garden tending to the roses Alice loves so much. Alice is still with us, her mind sharp and her heart at peace. The golden child is never mentioned in the house anymore. He has been legally and emotionally erased. I often sit in my office and look at the tax shield document. It's a simple piece of paper, but it was the kill switch that saved a family. People ask me why I don't just relax and enjoy my retirement. I tell them that as long as there are golden children who think they can steal from the vulnerable, Martha Vance will always have her pen ready. I recently received a letter from Julian from prison. He was asking for forgiveness and a small loan to help him get started when he gets out. I didn't write back. Instead, I put the letter in a file labeled Evidence of Continued Solicitation and added it to the restraining order file. In the world of probate law, the case is never truly closed until the final accounts are settled. And in the case of Julian Vance, the balance is 0. I sipped a tea and looked out at the historic estate. The lights were on, the family was safe, and the fine print had done its job. Justice, like a well-drafted will, is a beautiful thing to behold.